Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the 10 barriers of authentic communication in the workplace and how to eliminate them. Warm welcome to wherever you are. It's 12 midday here in Brisbane, but it could be other times wherever you are in the world. I just want to check and make sure that I'm being heard. So those of you who are aware of how this works, if you go to the right-hand side in the question box, and if you could just type in there, give me an indication that I'm coming across loud and clear. Thanks, Byron. Anyone else, can you just indicate that you can? I'm audible. I guess that's the important thing. I guess if I'm not audible, you won't be able to do anything. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, William. Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Jim. All right, look, it sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is excellent. So I want to tell you a little situation that occurred not long ago, several months ago, but in the bigger scheme of things, it's not long. I want to tell you a little story that I think encapsulates what today's broadcast is all about. I was working in a large engineering consulting firm and doing some consulting work for them, and there was a major project, multidisciplinary project, where there were 25 engineers involved in this major project. So we had civil engineers and we had environmental engineers, we had a range of different professions who were all working towards this major project. And two of the engineers who were working on this project were sitting facing each other in an open office environment. So in fact, the only thing that actually separated them was the partition that you get in an open office environment. But essentially they were facing each other and there was just a large partition between them, the normal sort of open office environment that you expect. And in this situation, one of the engineers, one of the 25 engineers on this project, was particularly upset with his colleague. So this was the person sitting on the other side of the partition. He thought that this person wasn't being very professional in the work that they were doing, and he was quite upset about what he thought was sloppy workmanship. So what he did is he sent an email. He tapped out an email of several paragraphs long, outlining his objection and his frustration and his concerns to his colleague. So think about it for a moment. His colleague's only sitting maybe a metre or a little bit more away, and here's this person furiously typing out an email. He's just about to click the send button or the enter button. He's just about to let the email go, and he stopped and he thought, well, in the interests of accountability, I will make sure that I copy in my other three colleagues. So he copied in the other three colleagues involved in the project, and off it went. Now, I don't have to tell you the end of the story. You already know that there was going to be some serious conflict going on in that workplace as a result of that approach. But it's probably also true to say that in our working environment, there is considerable numbers of incidents that occur every day where people are using email when they really should be having an authentic conversation. So I just wanted to set the scene by talking about that and how destructive it can be when we don't actually have a normal conversation with somebody. All right, so let's talk about conversations for a little moment, and then I'll get into these 10 barriers and we'll talk a little bit around how you might overcome those barriers. So one of the things that I talk about in one of my books, which is Conversations at Work, which has been co-authored with Aubrey Warren, one of the things that we talk about in this book is we argue that organisations are conversations. In other words, They're groups of people all working towards a common cause who, from time to time, need to have conversations with each other. Most of those conversations, of course, are task related. So it's an interesting way, isn't it, of thinking of organisations as a series of conversations, and that's true. But there's two different types of conversations. There are conversations that are task related, and there are conversations that are people related. Now, some conversations are a bit of both, but actually, if you think about it, it's probably likely that 70, 80 or even 90% of conversations that we have in the workplace are actually task related rather than people related. Now, I'm not suggesting that that necessarily is a bad thing, but there is enormous bias towards technical conversations, and what that means is that we have very little time left over to have the people-related or the developmental conversations, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on. So workplaces or organisations are really a series of conversations. They happen in the boardroom, they happen in the lunchroom, they happen in the car, they happen in the outside, they happen in the hallway, they happen in the corridor, they happen near the water cooler. These conversations go on every single day in a variety of different ways. Some of these conversations are long, some of them are short, some of them are boring, some of them are interesting, some of them are memorable, some of them are not, and it goes on and on and on. And we're all in that business, aren't we, of talking to each other on a regular basis. So I pose the question, are quality conversations sadly neglected? And I would argue that they are. I would say that the majority of us are having what Grattan and her colleagues call dehydrated conversations. We're having conversations that are very much stock standard conversations about things, and we don't have conversations necessarily about the important things of developing people in work. And so in that sense, I think we sometimes don't have quality conversations. I think there's a problem that a lot of people will assume that there is an art form to conversations. People often say, conversations is an art form. I don't think it is. I think that there are some conversations that are more difficult than others. For example, the difficult confrontational conversation is difficult. There's no question about that. It's challenging. But I don't necessarily, and yes, there are skills that are needed to have those conversations, no doubt about that. And if you look in any bookstore, you'll notice that the books on conversations are very much around the challenging conversation or the tough conversation or the difficult conversation. But what's curious is that I don't think we're having enough of any conversations, let alone tough conversations. So we're not having encouraging conversations. We're not having visioning conversations. We're not having coaching conversations. So these are all conversations that really don't require a high skill level, but nevertheless are being neglected. So, and I think sometimes it's a bit of a cop-out to say that conversation's an art form, because you and I in this broadcast are used to having hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of conversations with a variety of different people about a host of different topics. So we've had plenty of practice. So I'm not too sure that there's necessarily a great art form. And in fact, it's interesting that if your parents were alive today and you said to your parents, imagine if you actually said to them, guess what we're doing at work tomorrow? And they say, what? And you say, well, we're having at work, we're having training to learn how to have conversations. I think your parents would be very amused. And that's sort of an interesting, isn't it, that we've moved so far away from this whole notion of conversations that we actually get a situation where we have to have training to have conversations. I'm not suggesting that training doesn't help, but it's quite unusual, and I'm sure, 30 years ago, there wasn't too many courses around on conversations. Now, of course, there's a plethora of those sort of programs. You only, if you travelled on public transport this morning to work and you're going home on public transport, why don't you just look up from your iPad or whatever you're looking at and have a look around the bus or the train, and you'll be absolutely shocked. Maybe not. The fact is, everyone will have their head buried in a screen, and when they get home at night they have their head buried in another screen, which is called a television, all the while making Facebook updates and so forth. So conversations, I think, you know, we're having less of them, and we're having less quality conversations, and I guess there's reasons for that, there's barriers. Another key point that I'd like to raise with you is, it's coming up on your screen. Look, there it comes now, hopefully. It takes a while to load up. And that is that, you know, I just posed the question, have we lost the need for conversations? I don't think so. You know, if you go back to my scenario before with the two engineers, I think it would be fair to say that's the perfect opportunity to have a conversation, albeit a difficult conversation, but nevertheless, you know, you can't do that via email. And you could avoid it, but it's not going to go away, is it? There's still going to be issues that need to be dealt with. It's the elephant in the room, as they say. So, you know, I don't think we've lost the need for them. I had a manager say to me the other day, which I found rather amusing. He said to me, you know, in our organisation, we don't have time for conversations. And I found that quite amusing because, you know, what does that actually mean? So, of course, his assumption was that conversations are a waste of time, or even just a value added that don't add any great value to the business that we do, which is completely untrue. The world revolves around conversations, and I think sometimes we forget about how powerful they can be. Truly, it's not easy to measure them as far as how effective they are. We can't put a number on it, we can't quantify it, but the reality is that conversations are still and will continue to be, in my view, very important. Now, two of my colleagues in the United States, in a book that they wrote, Kusner and Posner, and the book's called Credibility, great title, and so they're talking about the whole notion of being a credible leader. And they would argue, and they have this lovely little gem of a phrase in, I think it's chapter 1, they talk about leadership is a relationship. I think that's absolutely brilliant and on the mark. So their argument is, in order to be an effective leader, that is, somebody that's influencing the outcome of somebody else that works with them, you have to have some sort of a constructive working relationship. And I think that's a really important point. So my question to Kusner and Posner is simply this. How do you have a relationship with someone? And the answer, of course, is one conversation at a time. You can't have a relationship with someone via email. You can't have a relationship with someone via text. Not a really meaningful, useful working relationship, that is. Perhaps a superficial one, but not a relationship that's actually based on trust, mutual respect, and authenticity. So you can't get away from it. If you're a leader in this broadcast and you're looking at having greater influence on the people that you lead, you have no other option but to have more conversations. And the conversations that I'm recommending are people development conversations rather than the task-related conversations I mentioned earlier. All right, so there's a little bit of background about conversations that you might like to ponder, and certainly there's more in my book on that. Now, you know, we're talking about these 10 barriers, so let's get stuck into it. The number one barrier the number one barrier is a psychological barrier. It's not a physical barrier like walls. It's not a barrier around technology. The barrier is a psychological contract. Now, what's a psychological contract? Well, psychological meaning in your head, contract meaning between two or more people. A psychological contract means it is an understanding between two or more people about how they go about their business. So an employee, when they work for an organisation, has in their head at least some sort of notion about how they expect to be treated by the company or the organisation to which they're employed. And at the same time, that individual has some expectations about what they can offer the organisation in return for these types of expectations from the organisation. At the same time, the managers of the organisation have a clear, in their head at least, perspective about what they want employees to do and what they expect, and at the same time they have some clear expectations around what the organisation can do in return for that. Now, this psychological contract's been around for a couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, and it's only in the last 30 years that the contract is actually changing profoundly. In other words, employees and managers have different expectations of how they and others should act in the workplace. I'll give you a very simple example. 30 years ago, managers would have an expectation that employees would be reliable in terms of the work that they do. In other words, there's a consistency and a reliability around what they produce. Now there's an expectation that managers expect employees to be enterprising and show initiative, completely opposite to what the expectation was 30 years ago. So these changing expectations create conflict, and often this, because it's a psychological contract as distinct from an enterprise agreement, these things aren't normally talked about. So if a manager has a very traditional notion of what the employment relationship's about, which means that he or she may think that he or she should do all the thinking and the people that work for him or her should do all the doing, then it's going to create a culture where people aren't talking to each other because the manager just thinks that their job is essentially about giving people direction and certainty, and you can see that that's going to stifle the capacity. It's a barrier to having good conversations. Likewise, if you've got an employee who has a very traditional notion of what the psychological contract's all about, in other words, they just want to be told what to do and they don't want to think, then clearly if the manager's making an attempt to have some sort of dialogue with the employee, then the employee is going to think, well, what's all this about? Why don't you just tell me what you need to do? I don't need to be involved in all that sort of stuff. So the number one barrier is the view that the manager has about him or herself and how he or she should conduct his or her relationship with the people that report directly to him. There is nothing that is more powerful in terms of stifling or encouraging conversation. And I might do a webinar on this whole area at some point in the future because it's something that's of great interest to lots of people according to feedback I receive. So let's look at 9 other barriers. And these barriers are all real and we know that they exist at different times. One of the barriers, of course, is this inattention during a conversation. We all do it. We're all sort of thinking of something else while somebody's talking, and we all assume we know what the next sentence is going to be or what this person's all about because we come across them each day. Or we all justify and say that, you know what, I'm a multitasker. And of course, the latest research is showing very clearly that we aren't very good at multitasking. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female and all the jokes that go with that. The reality is all of us are not very effective at doing two things at once. In fact, what happens is we don't do justice to either thing. So we're far better to down tools and just do one thing really well, get it off our list, and then get on with something else. Easier said than done, I realise. So think of a scenario where you've got one of your team members who comes to see you in your office, and you're right in the middle of banging out an email, and you say to the person at the doorway, look, let me know what you're saying, but just realise I've got to get this email out before the close of business. So keep talking, I'm listening. So what you're trying to do, of course, is do two things at once, complete the email and also listening to what the person says. Well, the first important thing is that the person at the door probably thinks that their priority isn't particularly important, because if it was, you'd close the laptop or whatever you're using and give them 100% attention. But then on the other hand, you're probably not doing justice to the email either. So you're better off to say to the person at the doorway, listen, I have to get this email done by the close of business. As soon as I've done this, I'll come over and see you, and so just bear with me. Right? That's the obvious thing to do, but it doesn't happen very often, does it? Or, of course, if the email isn't that important but the other person looks agitated at the door, then perhaps we should stop the email and actually give them 100% attention. So that's a big one, and we're all guilty of it, but really it's a barrier to conversation. Another barrier to conversation is one that's a real bugbear of mine. I've written about this lately, and some of you might have seen some of the articles I've written on this, is that the whole notion that, you know, you'll get told on a need-to-know basis. So in other words, we don't tell people what's going on. And why don't we do that? Why don't we tell our employees the full story? And the reason is based on a false assumption. The false assumption is that employees can't be trusted with sensitive information. So what we tend to do is not tell people because we're worried that either they'll go to the media or they'll go to the union, or something will happen that's negative. So it's much safer not to tell people what's going on. I had a situation recently where I was working in a government department, and we've got some survey results coming out on the climate, and the managers were paranoid about, you know, talking about these results and sharing it with the people that gave the very input in the first place, because they were worried that they'd go off and run off to the local newspaper and so forth. So it's quite farcical that we're asking people to input information, and yet we don't want to have a conversation about what that information's about. And this happens everywhere. So this is a serious barrier to having conversations, this attitude that employees can't be trusted. Look, some can be trusted and some can't. But why do we think that managers are more trustworthy than employees? There's plenty of leaking that goes on in boardrooms around the world. So to suggest that we don't share information with employees because they're less trustworthy is absolutely ridiculous. And of course, employees are very aware of that assumption underpinning restricted information channels. Number 3, one big barrier is feedback. And in fact, I know most of you in this webinar are from Australia, but there are people from overseas. I can tell you now that Australians are the worst in the world at giving feedback. Survey after survey shows that we're hopeless at it. Now, you know, I've got my theory on why that's the case, but I'd have to say to you that it's a serious setback. So, you know, if you aren't prepared to give people positive and negative feedback, then you're not prepared to have conversations with people that can be quite powerful and useful. That's a barrier. So, in fact, I've seen studies that show that people who only give people who only give negative feedback, so they don't give any positive feedback at all, and compared with people who give no feedback, the level of engagement is higher with people who only give negative feedback. How fascinating is that? So in other words, by not giving any feedback at all is the quickest and surest way to disengage people. People want to know. They mightn't like what they hear, but they want to know nevertheless. Okay, another barrier to conversations, authentic conversations, is the whole notion that a culture of not asking questions. Now, most people, as we all know, that get promoted into managerial and leadership roles, get there because they're good technical operators. So they're good, they might be good engineers, so they become a manager of engineering, or they're good accountants, so they become the corporate services manager, or they're, they're good marketers, so they become, the head of marketing. Now, the problem with that, of course, there's a lot of problems with it, but one of the problems is that when you learn something at university or through a trade or wherever you've learnt your craft, you have learnt to answer questions. In fact, that's the whole point of being an expert, is to be able to respond to the questions that you're being asked and to be able to do it in a thorough, methodical and effective way. Trouble is, when you're a leader, you are not any longer in the business of answering questions. You are actually in the business of, you got it, asking questions. And this becomes critically important. And for leaders, they find it's extremely difficult to make the adjustment from answering to asking. So that's another barrier. So leaders have got to learn to ask questions, not answer questions. And the questions, of course, are why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. They're all open-ended questions that precipitate more than a yes or no response. And that's how we have conversations. Okay, another barrier, and one that I think organisations are definitely starting to address, is the notion of formality. So a lot of managers still have the majority of conversations in their office, sometimes even across their desk. Big mistake, because it's your turf, you feel comfortable, but the reality is the other person probably doesn't feel as comfortable as they could, and it doesn't actually add to creating a stimulating dialogue. So my suggestion is that a good thing to do is to get out of that office, get out of your cave, and go and actually have a conversation in a space that could be well worthwhile for you. Where coffee shops actually are good stimulants for conversations. Apart from having a good cup of coffee, if that's what you're into, you can actually get more done sometimes in a relaxed environment like that. So too much formality, that's a real issue and a barrier. Now, it had to come up at some point. I started with this at the beginning, and I really probably need to bring it up again, is our over-reliance on email. Now, as I said, I gave you the example of the two engineers at the beginning of this broadcast, but the truth of the matter is the average person spends 2.5 hours a day attending to email. So you might want to think, how close am I to the average? But that's essentially the average, 2.5 hours. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that email isn't useful and that we shouldn't be spending considerable chunks of our day completing email, because obviously it's a very useful tool. But sometimes what happens, such as the example at the beginning that I gave you, is that we will over-rely on email, and sometimes we'll try and have a conversation via email. This is a big mistake. Emails, or the use of email, is what we call asynchronous. In other words, it means that when you send an email, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a response straight back. It might take hours, days, weeks, or even months to get a reply. So it's asynchronous, and so therefore it's not a good medium for having a conversation with another person. So it's far better to get on the video, some sort of a teleconferencing type of medium, get on the telephone, or go and, even better, if it's possible, go and have a face-to-face conversation with the person is far more efficient. So let's not over-rely on email, but I think that most of us do, and clearly that's going to be a barrier. So next time you're about to tap out the email, just think for yourself, listen, is this the best way to go with this, or is it just better for me to pick up the phone and ring the person? Sometimes the phone call is a much more effective way to go. And I know sometimes the phone call will take you through to message bank and you're back to square one with an asynchronous type of response. So nevertheless, don't expect that you can have powerful, effective, authentic conversations via email. You're deluding yourself if you believe that. Okay, number seven on the list when it comes up. Here we go. What are your senior managers doing in the office? And, you know, I find that if the senior managers are not having authentic conversations with each other, then I know for sure that we won't have a conversation culture, right? So if senior managers are seen behind closed doors having secret meetings, if senior managers are seen being quite hostile with each other, or at the other end, if senior managers are seen not talking to each other and they're preaching the need to have conversations, I can assure you that it won't happen. And it won't happen because they're not walking the talk. And so the best place to start having serious conversations is at the senior level. And if the senior team are doing it, then it's easy to model the way. And I see this so often in organisations that managers at senior levels are saying, well, I want everybody to have, you know, why aren't our middle managers and our supervisors indulging in more developmental conversations with the people that work with them? And the reason for that is very simple. It's because you're not. And people are seeing you not interact and with other people, and they're just assuming that that's the way things are done around here. And it's a fair assumption because that's actually what happens. So if you were saying to me, how do I change the organisation I work in to become a culture of conversation, I would say to you, let's work with your senior team first and foremost. That would be the place to start. So if you're a senior manager, you might like to consider the quality of the conversations that you have with your colleagues. Now, another reason, of course, that we don't have conversations, meaningful conversations in our workplace, another barrier, if you like, is that we're fearful of opening a can of worms. You know, let sleeping dogs lie. I don't want to rock the boat. All these cliches that we hear are really saying, I don't want to create emotion. I don't want to go there. So I will just ignore that situation, which ultimately is an elephant in the room, because I'm fearful about how the other person may react, and it's just not worth my while doing that. That's our justification. But don't think for a minute that because you're not having conversations with people, because you're worried about bringing up sensitive issues that the other person may take in a negative vein, don't think for a minute by not bringing them up you're actually doing good. You are not. You're creating a source of frustration, and you're going to find that that will manifest itself in some way, shape or form with the work that's being done. So my advice to you is pretty simple. Take a deep breath and go and have the conversation with the other person. You'll find that in a lot of times it'll actually come out better than you think. All you've got to do is just be sensitive and aware and broach the subject and you'll feel 100% better once you've done it, because there's a little part of your subconscious that's telling you that you really need to go and talk to Mary about her poor reporting and her lack of ability to meet deadlines. But you don't want to do it because Mary may burst into tears. Okay, now Mary's not going to all of a sudden get an epiphany and think, I need to turn up on time, or I need to make sure that I spell check my reports. She's not going to do that. She's just going to continue, and the reason she's going to continue is because she's getting no feedback otherwise. So why wouldn't I continue? I don't see any problem with what I'm doing. If there was a problem, of course, my boss would be talking to me. And if there is, I wish he would. So this is this funny paradox that goes on in the workplace all the time. So that's number 8. Number 9 is the physical layout of the office. Look, the reality is, it's interesting how we moved away from everyone having an office to an open office layout probably 30 odd years ago. And we did that because we were trying to cultivate a situation where people would be a little bit more open and people would communicate more, with greater frequency. The problem with that, of course, is that what's happening is, yes, people are talking more, they're having more conversations, but people now are very aware that their conversation is being overheard by several people. And because of that, they tend not to say what they want to say. And we have a whole lot of superficial conversations going on in open office environments that really are fairly meaningless. And by the time I book the boardroom to have the conversation, it's probably not worth it, so I won't go there. So the office layout, ironically, that's open office, is not necessarily conducive to having authentic, meaningful conversations. Interesting, isn't it? So we need to create a mechanism where there is spaces for people to be able to go to talk about things in private that need to be discussed, and we need to encourage people to take those opportunities because it's critically important. Right, so I want to finish up now and just, and by the way, I've thrown a lot at you, and I'm going to throw still more at you, because I want to talk about 10 conversations that I think you should be having. And so how do we fill this void? Hopefully I've created a space to say we need to have more people conversations. So what do they look like? I'll go through that with you in a moment. But what I'd like you to do, if you've got any questions, just type them in over on the question box, because I'll respond to them as they come in. That way I'm not leaving it to the end, and so forth. So if there's anything that I've said that you think you'd like to comment on, or anything that I said that you'd like to ask a question of, go for your life. I'll do what I can to respond to it as best I possibly can. So just type it in there, and I'll just keep an eye on that as we go. So many of you who would be aware of the work that I do would be aware that I have a framework called the 5 Conversations Framework. And the 5 Conversations Framework was a framework that I brought into play because I felt that, and I'm not a believer in performance reviews, and I've often thought they're a waste of time and energy, and how can we possibly improve on that? So this is what this framework's all about. But I find there's a lot of organisations all over the world that are using the 5 Conversations Framework just as an enabler to ensure that we're getting better conversation flow in the office, and so that when we do have our performance review, we can actually have a better performance review. So you can look at it both ways, as a replacement for the review, or perhaps just to create a framework where we're talking about important things in the workplace. So I'll just briefly run through this with you. If you haven't, bear with me if you're used to this and using it, and I'd be interested to hear if you've got any feedback if you're using this approach. But as you can see on the left-hand side, there are 5 months, and this framework recommends that you have 5 15-minute conversations once a month over a 5-month period. And as I said earlier on, I had a manager say to me, well, we don't have time for that. But, you know, I would argue you can't afford not to have time for this, because this is all about people. This is all about getting the best from people that work with you. So it's kind of one of those things that if you don't do it, you'll pay a price. And if you do it, you'll gain enormous benefits, as many organisations have found. So in month 1, we have a climate review conversation, which is really a pretty simple conversation around morale, communication, and job satisfaction. In fact, the first question there is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? A person might say, 6, and then you say, why? So it opens up a dialogue around job satisfaction. And then, of course, it moves on to how we might get it from a 6 to an 8, and what I, as your leader, can do to attempt to get it from a 6 to an 8. So all these questions are pre-planned. We ask the employee to come to these conversations already thinking about the questions so that they're not blindsided and they've got a thoughtful answer. In month 2, we go into strengths and talents, and really, instead of just going straight for the jugular and talking about things that people aren't doing well, how about we go at the other end and talk about things that people are doing right, which of course is strengths and talents. So what are the attributes that people can bring to work which are things that they do particularly well? Now, if you're sitting there thinking, you know what, I can't think of anything, I can't think of any attribute that this person brings to the workplace, then my suggestion to you is to think harder. There is something, it's just that you probably haven't really got around to thinking about it. And again, why don't we start with an upward spiral of positivity rather than a downward spiral of negativity? So what are the things that people can offer in the workplace? Do they have a talent around dealing with clients? Are they good at dissecting information into small bite-sized pieces? Are they good at assessing risk? Do they have the capacity to mediate issues? What are they actually good at? Are they good at putting graphs together? Do they do a mean PowerPoint? I have no idea, but you need to ask them the question. And again, if the person is prepared, they'll come to the conversation with that in mind, and that's the critically important thing, that they've thought about it. So you don't start off by asking someone, what's your strength? And they say, I don't know, I've never thought about it. I want them to think about it before the conversation so we have a rich conversation. They might not, you might have a different view about that. You say, well, what about this? And they say, oh, I've never really thought about that. So you open that up. But the key thing around that second conversation is, the question then is, how can we utilize that strength and talent in the current work you do, or even in the future work that you may do? So how can we utilize that? That's the critically important part. So have a think about that. Then we have opportunities for growth. Opportunities for growth are around the things that people can develop and improve on. That of the 5 conversations is the most difficult one. But again, we should be talking about things that people should be working on and improving. We've all got things that we can improve on. Again, I want the employees to come to that conversation having thought about that. And I don't want to talk about 25 things. I'm quite happy to talk about 1 or 2 things. Conversation 4, now you could imagine out of the strengths and talents conversation and the learning and the opportunities for growth conversation, there's likely to be a whole lot of learning opportunities. So we have a learning and development conversation. And a learning and development conversation is not sending people off to a management program or an emotional intelligence course. A learning and development conversation could be about you and what you can coach the person in, or what someone else might coach the person in, or it could be around, it's just simply explaining something to someone in a little bit more detail so that they can understand the bigger picture. And the final conversation is around innovation and continuous improvement. And I find that very exciting, that can you imagine in your organisation, irrespective of how large it is, or if you're a consultant working with organisations, think about this for a moment. If, for example, in the month of June, every single person in this organisation is having a conversation on innovation and continuous improvement, that's exciting, because out of that, undoubtedly, there will be some very useful, practical, cost-effective, easy to implement, easy to buy in solutions to improving the quality, the efficiency and effectiveness of the organisation. Now, not everything will be great, but I reckon there'll be a few things that will be quite good or excellent. But if we don't have conversations about things like that, then how can we possibly expect people to come to work with their brains and not leave them at a paper bag in the door at the doorway? If we're asking people, and of course it's not just sitting there saying to someone, what ideas have you got? Because people freeze when you ask them those questions. But the questions in month 5 around innovation and continuous improvement are questions around how can we do things faster, how can we do things easier, how can we do things safer, how can we do things with greater quality at the same cost, how can we reduce costs, how can we improve interpersonal relations between the various functions in this business, how can we improve the quality of our customer service. So all of these questions are targeted aspects of the business that are critically important. And if you are prepared to have that conversation with people, and the people are prepared to actually come to that conversation having thought about it, and there are things that are actually enacted because of those conversations, you won't have any problem about creating an efficient and effective environment to work in. So that's month 5. Right, so that's one type of, so there's 5 conversations you can have straight off the bat. Let's look at 5 more conversations that you can have that are critically important, and then we'll wrap up and we can, so keep the questions coming in, folks. If you've got comments, statements, observations or whatever, keep them coming in, because I'm more than happy to take them as they come. So here are 5 more conversations. Now, people will often say, well, coaching's not a conversation, surely. Well, yes, it should be. And I'm talking about a coaching conversation around helping people to, develop an approach or a strategy to how they might deal with something. So it should be an ongoing conversation on a regular basis. And of course, we now know that a lot of leadership literature is now talking about the leader as the coach, because we know it's effective. So as a leader, you should be having regular coaching conversations. It doesn't necessarily have to be some formal approach. It can be just very much tossing around concepts and ideas to help that person clarify their thoughts around what they do. So that's really important. Of course, many of you have had great mentors in your life, and I think that's wonderful. And I have too, and they can be life-changing, as the cliche goes, but they're absolutely life-changing. So, be prepared, certainly if you've been around the ridges for a while in your industry, be prepared to adopt a mentoring conversation if and when the situation arises. You might actually find that people seek you out for your advice, and take that opportunity and run with it, because I know that you get a lot of satisfaction out of mentoring other people. I know that because I've done it all my life. I also know that the person on the receiving end can receive an enormous amount of encouragement from mentoring. So be a mentor wherever that situation arises. Delegation, of course, should be a conversation. I don't, obviously if you're you know, if it's go for delegation, we're just asking someone to photocopy something. Clearly that's not a conversation. But where you've got something involved, where you're actually delegating this to somebody else to do, so it might be a major project, then it's a conversation, it's a dialogue, it's one that you should be having where there's a toing and froing and it's not just a one-way type of a scenario. So that's the third conversation in these 5, or I suppose the 8th conversation if you consider the 5 that went before and the 2 others. These last 2 conversations I want to share with you are conversations that really don't happen very often, and it really disturbs me. The visioning conversation. This is the why conversation. The why of work, as the book that's written by Dave Ulrich, The Why of Work. We should be explaining to people the why, giving people a clarity around the line of sight between what people do and the end result. So this is the why of work. This is the visioning conversation. Now, I'm not talking about sharing with people the strategic plan, although sometimes that's a good idea. I'm talking about explaining to people the relevance and significance of what they do in the big scheme of things. That's what I'm talking about. So let me give you a very simple and practical and hopefully powerful example. Let's assume that you're working in a production area, and let's assume that it's the end of a shift. And let's assume that you're the manager who actually goes up to somebody and asks them to sweep the floor before they finish the shift, at the end of the shift. Now, normally that person would groan and complain about that because, you know, they don't see it as their job. But if you said to that person as the leader, if you said, well, look, the reason I'm asking you to do this is that we have a new or prospective customer coming in this evening who wants to have a bit of a look over the production area, and we want to create the very best impression that we possibly can, because obviously winning their business could be a significant benefit to everybody, and that's why I'm asking you to do this, because I want to create the right impression for this customer or potential customer. You see what that does? Now, you might assume the person that you're being asked to sweep the floor might know that. But look, this is the problem. 2 reasons why people don't share the why of work. One is they assume that the employee already knows why they're doing something. Big mistake. And the second reason is simply that it takes time. And look, I haven't got time to be explaining to people what's going on. I just want them to do it. Well, if you want people to do it with relish and a little bit more engagement, you actually need to explain to them why they're doing what they're doing. So I don't think there's anything near enough conversations about visioning. And the final conversation in this particular framework, the second framework that I'm sharing with you, is the conversation that's encouraging. Now, I know you're all self-motivated, and so am I, and frankly, I don't need words of encouragement. I'm going to get on and do it no matter what. Well, you know what? Not everybody's like you or me. And the truth is, people need to feel encouraged. And sometimes just letting people know that you, 1, appreciate what they do, and 2, believe in them can go a significant way to helping them go the extra distance. So, you know, you might say, well, surely they would know that I believe that they can do the job. Well, not necessarily. We human beings are quite insecure. So let people know that you believe in them if you do, and if you don't, then have other conversations with them to help them develop their capabilities so that you can believe in them. But if you do believe in them, let them know that you do. And when they've done a job, say thank you. I really appreciate the job you did today, getting that report together. under difficult circumstances with time constraints. It's really been very helpful, and I'm very happy with what I've got. That can go a long way to building energy and so forth, but I think sometimes we leaders who've struggled to where we have in life, without too much encouragement, we think, well, if it's good enough for us, it's good enough for others. Just remember that not everyone is like you. So there you go. So I'm going to move on from there. So there's your 10 conversations. A couple of things that you might want to be aware of is this simple diagram that will be coming up on your screen very shortly. There we go. Shows you that we've got 3 positions that we can be in conversations. First position is when you're looking at things through your eyes, and in other words, you can't and won't appreciate the view of the other person. So if you see 2 people arguing in the hallway, they're actually in first position, finger pointing, loud voices, and they're both committed to their own particular position and defending it. Second position is where you can put yourself in the shoes of the other party, the other person. So this is where you take time and require a degree of objectivity to at least understand the other person's perspective. And that's a very, very good position to be in, but not as good as third position. Third position is where you can not only understand the other person's point of view, but you can also see, we sometimes call it the helicopter view, where we're actually looking down and we can see the full picture or context. So not only do we understand what the person's saying, we can also see the context in which they're saying what they're saying, and that's a superior position to be in. So to have constructive conversations, you need to be at least in second position, if not third. So just a thought to keep in mind. And finally, before we finish up, one of the important things that I've mentioned is that conversations are really about having or asking good questions. So really, at the end of the day, you should be asking really useful, powerful questions. As I said, why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. And if you do that, you're going to have a conversation. And that's really what it's about. So show me a good conversationalist, and I'll show you somebody that's good at asking questions. And that's essentially a core skill of a leader, is to be able to ask incisive, meaningful questions that open up a doorway of learning, so that we're all in the business of actually changing the way people think about things. All right, so that's the 2 key skills that I strongly recommend that you consider. So look, we've got time for 1 or 2 quick questions if we've got them. I notice everyone's gone a bit shy or whatever, but that's fine. If maybe it means that I've covered everything, who knows. But look, one thing I just want to create or raise awareness for you, quick plug. I've got a Lunch and Learn series starting on the 7th of July, and this is a program for leaders, and you can see over on the right hand side it includes 6 modules, and you know, we cover each of those because they are core skills in being a good leader. So if you would like to attend this, or if you're in an organisation you'd like to send people along, by all means we'd be happy to have you come along. The cost is very reasonable. It's $250 per person for the 6 sessions. You get slides, you get recordings, you get access to me. You know, you're obviously learning about 6 key things, and the good news is you can do it at your desk over lunch. So if you're interested in that, just shoot me an email at tim@winnersatwork.com.au, and I'll be more than happy to send you a flyer explaining all the details, timings, costs, everything else. So folks, that's it. I have enjoyed again working with you, and I hope you got something really useful out of the session today on conversations. And I guess the main thing now is just to make sure that you're having more conversations. And if you do that, you'll be doing the right thing for lots of reasons.